Hello there, and welcome back to The Price of Pain. Got a great episode that I think you'll find will turn into 2, maybe 3 episodes. My guest today is Dr. Larissa Strath and her friend Greta, who is right down here on the floor. So you may hear Greta sighing as she naps under the table throughout this episode as we talk about interactions between diet and pain. And the reason why I say this is going to end up a multiple episode series is because there's so much to talk about. And you all know that I love topics that are immediately applicable to you. So these are things that you can listen to and go and apply to your own lives straight away. Everybody, even if you don't love food as much as I do, everybody eats every day, hopefully. And so there'll be some great information here that you can tend to use in your daily lives. If you notice, my voice is a little bit raw. It's summer season, which means I get to coach some volleyball camps. Unfortunately, a lot of faculty are on vacations and we're dealing with rounds of COVID still, but we're back up and running. Hopefully you enjoyed the last episode with Dr. Erica Merriweather, and we're just going to keep the ball rolling with Dr. Strath here. And we'll have to hold off until episode 2 until you hear more about her background because her dissertation was so interesting. We just got right into it. So let's just get after it. Go ahead and roll it, Kat.
Welcome to The Price of Pain, brought to you by the Pain Research and Intervention Center of Excellence at the University of Florida. Let's join host Dr. Joshua Crow in conversations with scientists, healthcare providers, and industry professionals as we delve into the highly subjective experience of pain and the ongoing effort to reveal its influence on our everyday lives.
My dissertation was on bench to bedside.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I'm biased.
Right.
Everyone thinks their dissertation is the coolest thing in the world, but
Not everybody.
Yeah,
no. Yeah.
But I mean, we could talk about this more later, but it kind of shows everything that's been done, diet, pain related, gives a little bit of a taste from everything. And I was able to get them all published, which was really cool.
So all of it from your dissertation, you published chapters independently.
Yeah, and
Good
then
on you.
the introduction I structured into a review paper.
So tell me about the dissertation then, because I know we've talked about this before, but
Okay.
If you're that excited about it, if you think it's the best thing ever, then maybe you should
like I said,
share it with the
I'm
world.
biased. But so I was very lucky to be at an institution that was very collaborative, which was UAB, University of Alabama at Birmingham. Roger is an alum too, so I feel like this is just all coming full circle. And was able to participate in research just like across the spectra of just research in general. So one chapter was looking kind of at molecular stuff in mice. One chapter, then we went to like a epidemiological sample. So it was like 16,000 people. And then the third chapter was when we started to hone in on an actual specific pain disorder. And then the last chapter was an intervention. So that was really cool.
Yeah.
So the first chapter, like I said, it was in rats. And it was looking kind of at the neuroinflammation in their spinal cord.
Mm-hmm.
So we put the rats, they had either their regular chow or they had what we called the SAD diet, which stands for Standard American Diet.
Pretty accurate, yeah.
And it was made to just kind of mimic what the average American eats. So it had a lot of white flour, sugar, saturated fats, not a lot of vitamins and minerals.
How much of those things, just with regard to the rodents, so you have their normal chow, which one thing that I don't know if we've discussed this on the podcast, but I was very fortunate in my undergrad to get to work some research methodology in a rat lab.
Okay.
And that was not common where I came from. So yeah, it was super cool. So,
cool.
For an undergrad class to be able to use these giant like Westernberg Long Evans rats. And I did it's totally different than a psych degree. So I did state dependent learning and noise aversion and stuff.
Yeah.
But one thing that you learn, at least back then, is how well cared for the animals are, and really control. maybe even better so than if they were in the wild, right?
Oh yeah.
Really
For
controlled
sure.
light cycles and diet and all that stuff. So that's definitely not the standard American diet.
No.
So with regard to the chow versus the standard American diet, what are some of the biggest things that rats normally wouldn't eat that were involved in the SAD?
So for sure the refined carbohydrates. So the standard chow is obviously it's going to be healthy for the rat. It's going to be what the rat needs. It's got more complex carbohydrates. If you look at the pellets, you can see the fiber in it.
Right.
And then, so of course the carbohydrates is a big one. Those refined sugars, refined flours, everything's white, bleached, fibers removed. The other is the fats. There really isn't a whole lot of, especially saturated fats in regular chow. And so when you open the bag of the standard American diet to scoop it into their cages, it smells like cookie dough. Because it pretty much is cookie dough in pellets. You have to keep it refrigerated.
Now, is this available to the public? I mean, not saying I would want it, but if you wanted to, could you go buy a bag of this cookie dough pellet stuff? And
you have to order it special
we'll talk about that after the podcast.
Yeah. We'll chat later. Yeah. But yeah, so you and then the lack of vitamins and minerals, that's for sure. The addition of trans fats. Trans fats are not normally found in nature. The only places you're going to find it is in the stomachs of ruminating animals. So that is the only place that trans fats are kind of found naturally. Every time now in foods, if you see trans fats, that is all man-made fat, and that is why they cause such a problem, is because our bodies were not made to process trans fats.
With regard to diet.
Okay.
So you mentioned the relatively tightly controlled chow and what types of substrates the rodents would eat naturally versus the SAD, which sounds really tasty.
I know.
But rats in the city. I'm just curious. This is just I'm gonna get off the rails here a little bit. But rats that are scavenging for stuff, do they replicate a diet that they would normally find in the wild, if the city's not the wild? Or do you find that some of these things that you're about to tell us about the SAD also apply to urban rodents?
That's a good question that I'm
full of those.
I don't know. I know. Right. It's almost like,
Sorry, go ahead.
That's a good question that I would maybe ask to zoologist, person who studies that. But if I were to hypothesize, I would imagine that they would tend towards foods that make them feel good. And so if you think about dogs and cats, usually, well, not dogs, but
well, that's why I asked.
But but typically, from my understanding, when an animal eats something that does not make it feel great, they'll start to avoid it. So I believe that the regular chow would kind of mimic what they'd be normally eating, even if it were, a city, an urbanite. Yeah.
I would push back on that a little bit because humans are terrible at that. I'm an example of this. I've got a pretty steady diet of things that don't make me feel great at all, which I need to address. Right. And I don't feel the least bit self-conscious about that talking, to somebody with your background right now. 100% sarcasm. But, in dogs are a great example, right? I had a Pomeranian, supposed to be a Pomeranian, back when I was in high school. And he would eat himself sick all the time. Thanksgiving, throw the turkey carcass in the bin out by the side of the house, and that dog somehow got out and tipped the bin over and was eating a turkey carcass. I don't think Pomeranians would bring down turkeys in the wild, but he sure was going to town on that carcass and was not okay for days.
A while. It's probably just a lot. There's a lot.
Right. All of us that ate the turkey had the itis for a while, right?
Yeah, right.
It was very much like football and nap time, but that dog, it lasted for about a week. So he probably ate his weight in turkey skin and stuff.
Right.
Anyway, that's the only reason I asked. Is that'd be interesting. Please carry on.
Yeah, no, that's a very interesting question that I don't have the expertise on, but we can ask somebody.
Somebody knows.
Yep, somebody knows.
Okay.
Someone out there knows.
Feel free to put in the comments section or link any articles.
Yep.
Okay.
Yep. Where was I? Oh, so they were on either the standard American diet, SAD diet, or they were on the regular chow. And they were on it for 16 weeks. So what was very interesting and what you would expect is, the regular chow rats, they kind of grew to be normal, healthy sized rats. The SAD rats, they got very fluffy. We'll just put it that way. You held them and they kind of just oozed over your hand.
That's revolting.
They got very big, yeah. And then what we did is, so at 8 weeks and 16 weeks, you have to unfortunately euthanize someone or a lot of these animals, all of the animals, in order to look at their spinal cords.
So this was even 8 weeks on this diet, there was that much of a noticeable change in their body composition.
Yeah, big change. Because they have shorter lifespans, so the processes almost like speed up.
Sure.
And so, we euthanized some at 8 weeks and some at 16 weeks. And this is the only thing we'd done to them at this point was change their diet. You extract their spinal cords, put them under the microscope, do some cool staining, all that kind of stuff. And you count. I spent a lot of time counting microglial cells, which are basically one of the big immune cells in your central nervous system. And they are a really good indicator of neuroinflammation within the brain and the spinal cord. So that's what we stained for in the spinal cords of these rats.
Now with the microglial cells, is it the number of cells or the size of the cells? What are you looking for when you stain?
So in this particular experiment, we were looking at the number, because microglial cells will kind of like macrophages in the periphery. They'll kind of lay dormant until they're needed. And they can basically be turned on into different phenotypes depending on what they're needed for. So we're looking for activated microglia in the spinal cord. And when they're active, they're normally pumping out cytokines and scavenging for dead cells, trying to clear debris, all that kind of stuff, just like a macrophage, a white blood cell would in the periphery. This is just happening in the central nervous system. And it's very indicative of neuroinflammation. So the more, or I guess the greater amount of activated microglia you have, the hypothesis is the greater the amount of neuroinflammation within that area.
Stands to reason. Is it relatively compartmentalized? For example, would you see an increase in microglia in the brain if there was neuroinflammation in the spinal cord, or?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yep. Yep. From my understanding, you would. We were in this particular experiment, we were looking at the dorsal horn of the lumbar region of the spinal cord. That's a big pain processing area within the spinal cord, is the dorsal horn of the cord. And we were looking at lumbar because we eventually were going to injure their foot. So we needed to have nerves that would go there. So you slice the spinal cord, stain it, you're looking for activated microglia, and the rats that were fed the SAD diet had an exponentially greater amount of activated microglia compared to the regular. Nothing else had changed at all. So they hadn't been injured, nothing. So it stands to reason that, it was the diet that did it. And, even without injuring yourself or having any kind of external reason to have inflammation, it was just the consumption of these unhealthy nutrients.
Okay. And so if this is at 8 weeks, what, obviously whenever we talk about preclinical studies, animal studies, the question that everybody has is, okay, well, how does that relate to people? Obviously, we would expect the same proliferation of microglia in humans, But what I'm curious about is if they've been fed this from, a very young age throughout maturation, what would an 8-week-old rat, how would an 8-week-old rat compare to a human? Like what age would that correlate to?
So it's a hard question to answer because right now we don't have very great imaging techniques to look at the spinal cords of humans while they're alive.
Right, but I mean, just as far as
yeah.
just as far as lifespan though, like is an 8-week-old rat fully mature?
No.
So that would be an adolescent rat?
Yeah. So the rats that were in this particular study though were mature rats. They weren't fed it since their childhood.
Okay.
They were on regular chow and then switched over to a SAD diet. So
Okay.
they were all adults. So
Okay.
they were
But it was
eating
8 week
great.
long for the duration of the
Exactly. Yeah. So there was 8 weeks, and then there were some that were on for 16 weeks, and it was basically you saw this kind of exponential increase. That's that one graph, the red
Let's put it up.
and the white graph.
And if you're listening along on one of the audio only podcasts, you won't be able to see this, but I guess this is a good plug for those who are listening along. If you want to see some of the images that we're discussing here, we'll do our best to describe what we're seeing as we look at it. But you can always hop over to the YouTube channel and jump onto our episode there and see these for yourselves. All right, so we're looking at a graph here, and it looks like we're comparing the regular diet to the SAD diet.
Yep, and the white background is pre any kind of injury. So that was what I was saying earlier. The only thing that has changed about these rats is their diet.
So we have 2 data points there. It looks like 56 days and 112 days.
Yep, so that's your 8-week and your 16-week mark. So you can see that there's these increases in the amount of activated microglia in the SAD-fed rats versus the regular fed rats. Then you jump over to the other side. So that gray area, background of the graph, is days post CFA. So CFA is a inflammatory inducing injury.
Okay.
So it's an inflammatory injury that you can put, you just kind of shoot it into their hind paw. It makes the paw inflamed. It doesn't last super long, but it can give some really cool data.
And it's enough to elicit the inflammatory response cascade.
Yes, exactly. So as you can see on day 1, it's exactly what you would expect. You'd have, in both animals, you'd have this kind of increase in activated microglia as the immune system kind of kicks on. So we don't really see a huge difference. There were a little, a couple more in the SAD-fed rats.
So and I'm gonna interject here as we go. Looking at this, both the regular diet and the SAD diet are I don't want to use the word significantly, are much greater number of cells over what we're seeing in the pre-injury portion of the graph. It looks like almost twice as much.
Yeah.
But there's no difference between the two.
No.
At that point. This is only day 1. Okay.
Exactly. And so that's, expected, an expected response from any rat, as well as any human being, is that you would have kind of this increase in inflammatory processes. But what was interesting was the recovery from the injury. So normally, it doesn't take super long. As you can see, as the days kind of tick on, the regular fed rats are starting to get back to, same amount of activated microglia within that dorsal horn region as time goes on. But the SAD fed are not. They're still hanging out.
Stay elevated.
And it's elevated.
And so for each of the data points here, it looks like 8 days, 15 days, 29 days, 50 days post-injury, post-induced injury.
Yeah.
There is a significant difference between the amount of microglia in the regular diet and the SAD-fed rats for each of those data points. So at day 1 was the same, but the diet affected those who were on the SAD diet. It affected their ability to mitigate the inflammation, recover from the injury, and so on and so forth, where the others, it's hard to tell even with error bars, but again, it looks like On day one, as we're looking at this graph, it looks like both are in the ballpark of, and this is the mean number of microglia per, I would assume, per area. And so there's the units. I don't know if they're number. I guess it's just number of cells. So 60 cells per whatever the area is right at day one. Day two for the regular diet, it looks like it's down somewhere around 30. So it cuts it right in half, and that's just the natural response of the rat's body to basically go through this recovery phase, and then the microglia. What happens to the microglia when they go away? They
just go back to kind of that dormant phenotype until again they're needed, and they also go through their natural proliferation, apoptosis, those kinds of things as well.
And so and then the SAD diet, like I said, the regular diet went from 60 down to about 30. And the SAD diet was right around 60 as well, but is still elevated at least 40. It looks like it might even be a little bit above and stays there, maybe even going up a little throughout the next 40 days or so, all the way to the 50-day post-induced injury point.
Yeah, so they have a hard time recovering from this injury. And, it's kind of a hot topic now in social media, and everyone's talking about chronic inflammation, and I think it's great that it's being talked about, but this is kind of showing if you can't recover from an injury because of you're not eating well, even if you say you sprain your ankle, you cut yourself, and you have this inflammatory process, you're almost subjecting yourself to chronic inflammation, even though the injury might seemingly be gone. There's still within the central nervous system this inflammatory process going on.
And we know that chronic inflammation has quite a drastic effect on overall health across all organ systems.
Yes.
And so that's why I was asking a little bit about the age of the rats and so on and so forth. That's my misunderstanding initially, as far as the age when they were brought in, or level of maturation, I should say. Yeah. Because, I'd be interested to look at the literature, but chronic inflammation likely has an effect on development as well. And so if your body is in this inflammatory response process, then that's less of available resources that can be devoted to maturation of bone and nervous tissue and so on and so forth. And specifically because we're talking about spinal cord tissue, central nervous system tissues here. That's why I was curious, knowing how poorly fed the average human child is in America.
Well, one of the prime examples of this, one disease that is heavily induced by inflammation is type 2 diabetes.
Of course.
Used to be called juvenile diabetes.
Juvenile diabetes.
Juvenile diabetes was type 1. Adult onset diabetes was type 2.
Correct.
Sorry, correct myself there. We cannot call it adult onset diabetes anymore because so many children are getting type 2 diabetes. Type 2 diabetes is very, 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 very influenced by diet, obviously, but also very influenced by inflammation as well. And the fact that so many kids are getting it scares me a little bit, because I don't know what that's going to mean for their future in terms of other health issues, like how early on are you going to get cardiovascular disease? How is this going to affect your mental health? Because we're now learning that, people who have depression, they have inflammation of, the brain. What is this going to mean in terms of your quality of life later on? What is it going to mean for your chronic pain? Because obviously inflammation is involved in the pain process. Are you going to get chronic pain earlier? Or is this going to be more of a prevalence in this kind of generation that's growing up?
Like I said, widespread influence, right?
Yeah.
And not just on health, but specifically on maturation and development that may continue through adulthood to affect, the rest of maybe how well you can potentiate your own health. Exactly. Would be a way to think about it, right?
Yeah, exactly. And it's, I don't know, it's something that I think about. I think we as a society need to do better in terms of nutritional education. That's one of the biggest things that we could do now in order to try and combat some of that, because if you don't have the education, how am I to expect that you're going to go to the grocery store and make these informed choices if you have no idea, what you're talking about?
Well, only compounded, of course, by the fact that there's a strong relationship between socioeconomic status and quality of diet, right?
100%. Yeah.
Anybody that's tried to say, okay, well, I'm gonna eat healthy from here on out. There are two things that seem to be intimately related to that. The amount of money that you have to spend on a healthy diet, it's more costly to eat healthy, but also the time, right? If you're going to prepare your own food and preparing food for your family, and I'm guilty of this also. You get this, well, man, I don't have time, or it's so late that I don't want to cook and then do the dishes before I go to bed. It'd just be a lot easier to order pizza or hit the drive-through on the way home, or call DoorDash, which I've actually never done. Plug DoorDash, but
I've definitely done that.
going through COVID, I think, yeah. But there are a lot of impediments, but just like you said, just the education, because there certainly are ways that you can at least offset some of the time and cost as far as dietary behavior.
Yeah, and that's a very interesting field of research that it's not my primary field of research, but in the future, I think there was a time in my PhD where I was like, maybe I should go into policy, and try and and that's still not off the table, just because I think if we are to make a change, there's going to have to come from the top down as well as on the ground, because just some of the things we allow in our food is not great. The one kind of soapbox that my old PhD mentor and I, Rob Sorge, both share is the complete and utter lack of nutritional education in medical school. That could be a whole podcast. It's my personal soapbox. So part of me was like, do I want to go into that kind of space and try to work on medical school education? Because it's not fabulous. And they're the ones diagnosing people with these disorders, and the patient's going to look at them for a solution. And if they don't know that, the lifestyle choices that you're having and experiencing every day, and having to make are going to be impacting your outcomes, then, it's not the doctor's fault if they don't know to not tell them.
Right.
So.
And it's not that they don't get training, but when you look at all of the training that goes into diagnosis and treatment, as opposed to, and this may very well be across the board. I didn't go to medical school either, so I can't say, but know some people who have, I'm close with. However, shout out to my girlfriend, Michelle. Right. But, the obviously the focus in medicine is more on diagnosis and treatment, as opposed to prevention. And dietary behavior is, I think it would be safe to say that diet and activity together are the number one behavioral intervention, that if there's such a thing as a panacea of any kind, that's it. Proper diet, and of course you can throw in sleep in there as well. I think you probably should. I've probably already incensed somebody listening. Sleep. Yeah. But just the amount of time that's devoted to that is and with many things in medicine, we're working on the research, and then we have to publish the research, and then that has to get to the physicians. And so a lot of times what we're seeing in trends in the literature, that's still, I hate to say it, but I'm going to go ahead and say it out loud. In some cases, that's 5 to 10 years ahead of what's being disseminated clinically.
Exactly. And this was that's like I said, it was a soapbox of ours that we did a bunch of research, and there is actual research that has been done about the medical school education of nutrition. And a lot of the medical schools don't even meet the standard amount of hours for nutrition education. So yeah, so there's this compounding effect of like, I understand that, cancer and like all these things, please learn about that as well. Like, and I also understand that there's 24 hours in a day, but how can we get to a space where, nutrition, prevention, and as a treatment, because there is, we can talk about this later, there's a lot of research that's being done on diet as a treatment as well, within the medical school space, because within society, doctors are regarded as, that authority. And
Sure.
if they're starting to say, you need to do this, the XYZ with your diet, you need to, and they really start to push, diet, exercise, sleep, stress management, all those kinds of things, I think we'll see a big change. So, just to kind of circle back though on the kind of barriers to food access, I like to think that there's 4 of them. So income being one of them for sure. Obviously, we're in 2022 and the price of food is ridiculous right now.
Yeah, that's the truth.
And I am, slightly above the poverty line, and I'm feeling it. So I can't imagine if I was below the poverty line. And then you commented on, and I think they kind of are tied together, income and time. Because a lot of people who are, lower socioeconomic status, they're working multiple jobs.
Yeah.
So, the mom gets up in the morning, she works like all day, and then she has to go to her night shift, and she also has to feed her kids. And so I, met some people who have fed their kids McDonald's every day because they thought that as long as they're getting calories in, that's fine.
Right.
And it's easy and it's convenient. But
turns out all calories are not created equal.
no, a calorie is not a calorie.
which may bring to the third point, right?
Yeah.
And so what's the third barrier?
So third barrier would be the education piece, as well as and I'll kind of come back to that and plug cooking while here in a second. But,
yeah, I'd love to talk about that.
Yeah.
We've got a bit of time. So
yeah.
we can...
So but I would say there's the 4 of them. So 1 being income, 2, I would say climate change for sure. There's my kind of an aside nerding out on things is the planet is warming, and that is going to affect food, especially food that is very temperature sensitive. The research is interesting. We're in for a shock probably within the next couple of decades, and there will probably be a shift in the diets of human beings and the recommendations and actually the sources of where we're getting these things. So there's a really good book. It's called Uncertain Harvest. It's basically compiles all of this research about the future of food and a warming planet in a really digestible way. Pun intended. But from what I've heard, and this is, I think, something that I'm going to have to wrap my mind around, it's very common in other cultures, not so much in Western culture, is bugs is going to be a really big one where we get our protein from, because there's a lot of bugs. So there will be a lot of bugs, a lot of rice. Rice is going to be one that will
suffer or will become more common.
Will become more common.
Yeah, I'm totally cool with that. More so than the bugs.
More so than the bugs, yes. Things like caribou, algae. We'll need to start eating things like algae because it likes the warm. It likes being warm. But things like so climate change is going to be a big one.
That alone, for those who are maybe reluctant, and I don't think we'll run into this too much on the science podcast, but those who may be reluctant to accept the fact that climate change is a real issue.
Yeah.
Just the possibility that you may be eating a diet consisting of grasshoppers and algae would be enough for me to maybe recycle more or
exactly.
ride my bike more often instead of driving. I don't know, whatever can be done.
Yeah, exactly.
So
yeah.
When I get sushi, now this is going to sound really bougie.
Okay.
So it's not very often. I'm not a sushi guy. But I even try to get the rice paper or edamame paper because I don't like the taste of the seaweed paper in the sushi.
I'm not a huge fan of it either. It's a very particular
Yeah.
flavor.
Well, and it reminds me of, I used to have in my office way back in the day, I used to have an aquarium, freshwater aquarium in my office. Not a big one, but it was cool.
Yeah.
But you know that smell you get when it's like it's time to clean the aquarium and check the pH and all that stuff. And I always equate that to the sushi roll with the
Right.
seaweed. And so when you said algae, that's immediately where my mind
The
went.
dirty,
Yep.
the dirty tank.
Scrape,
All right, here's
scrape out the
dinner.
tank for some lunch, right? And then about the bug thing.
Mhm.
I've been to markets where dried bugs are a thing, and I went to a wedding in, let's see, this would have been Charleston.
Okay.
It's a while ago.
Yeah.
Two of my friends who are physicians, and longtime friends of mine, they were getting married, and so my wedding buddy, I was single at the time, and a mutual friend of ours like, well, we'll be a wedding. And we went around. They had a farmer's market there in the square in Charleston. It was fantastic. I loved it. But they had these cookies, just marvelous looking cookies, chocolate chip cookies, right? But they weren't just chocolate chip cookies. They were made with, it was either grasshopper or crickets.
Crickets is common. Crickets is very common.
Yeah, well, I passed on that. my wedding buddy was like, oh, I'll try one of those. She did not do well with that.
Well, yeah, and so like I said, it's not common in Western society to eat bugs.
Not on purpose.
Yeah. But so when I was in Malawi, Africa, and there was a street vendor who was selling it was crickets, and another one that is common is mealworms, dried mealworms.
Hard pass. Yeah.
So I tried them. They actually have barbecue flavoring on them, and I think it's a mind game for Western people, just because we didn't grow up eating that. And
Sure.
I mean, the same goes, like we would, talk about some of the things we would eat in, US and Canada.
Well,
and they would look at me like, that's disgusting.
You know what else they put barbecue on?
Yeah.
Pork, chicken.
Yeah.
These are all fine by me.
Chips.
Yeah. Yeah.
But it wasn't horrible. If I could, it wasn't the worst. It wasn't the worst thing ever. But again, like it's not something that we're used to. But we're probably going to have to get used to. There's actually a restaurant in New York that everything's made of bugs, and you wouldn't know. You would have no idea. They have like chocolate mousse. They have.
Does it
everything.
say anywhere? When you say you wouldn't know, if you didn't know, you wouldn't know. But I'm not going to accidentally wander into this place, right? Like I'm very much against this. I've never been to New York City. I've been overseas. I've never been to New York City, and the off chance that I would accidentally wander into the bug restaurant and eat a bug pizza or something is enough to make me not want to go to New York City.
Yeah.
Is it very clearly stated?
Yeah. Yeah. So going in kind of what you're in for. But if you
those that would go in there know what they're
but if you were to like get catering and then like cater a party and then have everybody eat everything and then after you're like, oh, by the way,
that was bugs.
They would have no idea.
Yeah. That's
so it's probably gonna become a reality. So climate change, a big one. Food access, big one, huge one. So if you just Google food deserts in America on the map, and there you can get like a heat map.
I think we have a heat map.
I brought the heat map.
Let's take a look at the heat map while you're describing this. Go ahead.
So there's a lot, especially in the southeast. So Alabama, Mississippi, Georgia, Florida is in there. On the heat map, there's not a lot of data available for Florida. So that's probably why, I would guess. So when you're talking about a food desert within an urban area, it's not having access to a grocery store within a mile, like if you by car. So if you think about it, walking with your groceries for a mile is a lot.
Yeah.
And within rural areas, I believe it's 10 miles.
Okay.
So a lot of that's going to have to come from infrastructure. So I had the pleasure of living in Alabama for the last 10 years of my life. And Alabama is one of the top places where there's food deserts. And I mean, when I was living there, I mean, I had access to a car and everything, but I was technically within a food desert because my closest grocery store was 3 miles.
Mm.
So if I didn't have a car,
Right.
I was, plumb out of luck. So
well, and that all ties in with what we were speaking of earlier.
Mhm.
So let's say, oh man, I have to walk a mile with groceries, which really does sound like a first world problems kind of thing.
Right.
You could think of worse things.
Yeah.
However, with just the amount that you could carry, the alternative is, well, you just don't shop for as much, right? But that means you have to go to the grocery store more frequently, and that's not a luxury that many people are able to enjoy.
And so, so when you look at the heat map, you'll see like that southeastern kind of quarter of the United States got a lot of food deserts. So more than 10% within those are all done by the counties.
Okay.
Of the states, and you can see kind of Alabama, Louisiana, Mississippi, Georgia, all over there is kind of. But what's interesting is
5 to 10% of the population then of that county would be in a food desert where they would have to go that far.
No car, no supermarket store within a mile.
Wow.
And it was really interesting is if you take a map of chronic pain prevalence, cardiovascular disease, and you do like a layover, it's almost identical.
Oh.
So, which is really kind of, I mean, it's interesting. It's sad, but it's interesting.
What's really wild to me though is if looking at this map, now there are some darker regions that would be greater than 10%. But you can see, for example, in the Southwest, a lot of those two large portions. That's reservation there.
Yep.
Yeah, but north of that, there's some really wide open, desolate country, but they're not dark on the heat map, and they still have, so the people who are, vacationing in, their seasonal home in Jackson Hole.
Yep.
They're good. They've got the money to make sure that, there's a grocery store right nearby and all that, and have a vehicle to get to it.
Yeah. And I mean, and so it's going to have to come from a lot of infrastructure stuff probably within the cities and the counties themselves. I know that in Birmingham, where I spent the last half of my Alabama stint, we were really great mayor there. I say we, I live there still, named Randall Woodfin, who's working really hard to kind of fix this within the Birmingham area. They've devoted a lot of money to, opening fresh supermarkets that are not only, geographically available, but they're also financially accessible. They have good quality food, because that's the other problem is that, you might have a grocery store kind of nearby, but especially when you're in lower income pockets of the city, the food quality isn't great. So even if you do have access to a store, it's not going to be, high quality.
I'd also be curious, because you said there are two components looking back at this heat map. And for those, again, that are just listening in, there's a really large cluster. This we're looking at a map of not just the continental U.S., but Alaska and Hawaii as well. And it's stratified. There's a fair part. For example, the lower 48 seems to be accounted for. Alaska and Hawaii, there's no data available. But for the rest, there's less than 2.5% of the population. And as Dr. Strath said, it's divided by county. So it's in categories: less than 2.5%, 2.5% to 5%, 5.1% to 10%, and then greater than 10%. And I alluded to some of the darker areas, like out west, for example. But there are plenty of those that are scattered throughout the Southeast. And I would say what we traditionally refer to as the South. I mean, you could almost follow the Mason-Dixon line and see where these counties are concentrated. Now, there are some smatterings in other parts of the country, up in the Dakotas and Montana, but just the vast majority of these counties that are 5 to 10% or 10% or greater are not just in rural areas in the South either. I look at this, and And throughout Louisiana and Mississippi, there are areas that are most certainly urban areas.
Mm-hmm.
And so I wonder if the component is also not just that they're, the distance, but you said that if they don't have a vehicle.
Exactly.
And so circling back to the socioeconomic status,
Mm-hmm.
because if you look at, again, like I said, I've never been to New York City, but I know where it is. And if you look up in that area, this is not an issue here. There's public
No.
transit, there's
Mm-hmm.
maybe more bodegas in the city and whatnot, because people in New York City notoriously don't have cars typically,
Exactly,
right?
yeah.
But it's not an issue there.
No.
It's down in the South.
Yeah, and that kind of ties into like another of my dissertation chapters that we were talking about earlier, where we did like the
Another
epidemiological.
publication.
I was lucky. I was spoiled at UAB.
I don't believe in luck, but that's hard work. That's good.
But so looking at the regards study.
Mm-hmm.
So the regards study started to look at racial and ethnic differences in like things like cardiovascular disease, geographical differences in cardiovascular disease, things like that, and stroke.
Mm-hmm.
And then it kind of expanded into this plethora of disorders. So it's a really neat study. One of the main hubs for it is UAB. So I kind of wandered over there one day and was like, do you have pain data on by any chance? Like, I don't see any pain publications coming out from the regards stuff, but do you have anything? And Dr. Suzanne Judd, awesome lady, she just was like, I think we do. Do you want to take a look at it? If we do, and I went, I will need help from a biostatistician. And she hooked me up with a great biostatistician. Shout out to Marquita. I wouldn't have published this paper without her, because I had never worked with a data set of 30,000 before.
That's insane.
And I use SPSS primarily as my statistical software, which involves clicking buttons.
Mm-hmm.
She uses actual code.
Yeah.
And what took her a few weeks would probably take me my entire 5-year PhD.
Right.
So basically about 16,000 had pain data available, and we were able to kind of make this pain variable binary. Yes, I have had pain for more than 6 months.
Mm-hmm.
No, I have not. And what we were able to do is use these previously derived diet patterns that the regards team created based off of food frequency questionnaires. There were 5 of them. So there's the convenience diet, which we were kind of touching on with pizza, Chinese food, takeout, all that kind of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
There was the sweets and fats, where it's primarily just like sugary drinks and high amounts of saturated fats.
Sounds awesome.
No,
Not
very
really.
sweet.
Not really.
There was the Southern diet, which is similar to sweets and fats, but the composition of what made up those sweets and fats is what was different. So there's, a lot of saturated fat, trans fat, think sweet tea, a lot of sugar, all those kinds of things.
Fried food.
Fried food.
Yeah.
And even if organ meats are great for you, but when you deep fry them, it's like it doesn't really offset. The good doesn't quite outweigh the bad,
Right.
Because you can get into a whole conversation about the fact that when you heat oil, you're going to get free radicals.
Yeah.
Again, that's a whole other thing.
This is, I want to point this out also. We've had a chance to talk about your dissertation data and continuing to intersperse with these other conversations. But there's so much practical information that I know that you carry around in your back pocket.
Yes.
And we've had conversations about this before. As a matter of fact, that we've talked about you coming on the podcast, but really started to hone in on that a little bit when we were at a conference in Cincinnati. Right? We're in Cincinnati.
We were in Cincinnati.
We sure were. That's right. That was a great conference and nice to get back in person. But the I guess we're just kind of shooting the breeze.
Yeah.
And there were maybe 5 topics that I would have loved to talk about, but we've been talking for almost 50 minutes now. On just your dissertation. And it's a wonderful plug for you and your many first author publications.
I know. It's
but when you're done talking about yourself, no, this has been really useful. But what I would like to do is see if you would be interested in maybe making this a 2-part podcast.
Yes, let's do that. And then,
Yeah,
we
and
can have.
because I would really like to also, this is so interesting as we've talked, that there were many points where I was like, hey, I could really spin this and kind of steer you back toward what got you into this and so on and so forth. But I was too interested in what we're talking about. So
It's so interesting.
I know, right? It's really good stuff. And I love topics and particularly podcast guests that much like the science I try to conduct.
Yeah.
People can take it and apply it.
Yeah.
Because so often as researchers, as scientists, we get very interested in something. And then when we talk to John Doe, Jane Doe on the street, all they want to know is, what does that mean for me? What can you do for my pain? What food should I be eating? And you're one of the few guests where there's a immediately applicable aspect to what you do. And even some resources that I think we should maybe bring chapter 1 to a close. And as much as I would like to talk for another hour and just split it up in post-production, what we could do is have you back on. I'd love to hear about how you got to this point in your training, in your education, in your research. And then, because we've had a chance to talk about the science, we can maybe lace the next conversation with a little bit of science, but steer a little bit more toward dietary recommendations. Well, not recommendations. I don't want to go too far out of scope, but some things that the science tells us that you can hit stop, hit pause, and start making a grocery list, or go, oh, do I eat too much of that? And one of the things that always fascinates me was TikTok. TikTok does not fascinate me, but
my algorithm's straight food.
Oh yeah. There's a physician on there who routinely debunks. I wish I could plug his name. I can't think of it, but by the time we come back for the next one, I will. But I want to say it's Dr. I want to say IDZ. Is you know the guy I'm talking about? Yeah. And he's phenomenal. Talking about physicians that do know their dietary stuff.
They've taken the time to know.
And so somebody will put up a video about like, oh, you should blah, 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 blah. And he debunks it and uses cited literature to do so. So all evidence-based. It's phenomenal. But for an example, there was a recent one. I went and got a blood panel recently.
Okay.
Divulging my, PHI stuff on for everybody to know.
At least it's you doing it, not me.
That's true, right? Or my physician.
Exactly.
But, so after anybody that's listened to more than one of these episodes, I had an injury a while back and it affected my activity. And then COVID came along and that affected my activity and definitely my diet. And now what I have is a litany of excuses for why I'm really just not in good shape at all. So I'm like, I knew that this was going to be the case. And like a good little boy, I went to a doctor about it, knowing that I was going to get bad news, but wanting it because of my background, I can make some adjustments.
How bad am I?
Right.
I just want to know the scope. And maybe,
I want to know where it is. I clearly know where I want to be, so I can just plan out.
Or maybe having like a happy surprise that you're not as deep in a hole as you thought you were.
I did get a little bit of that.
Yay!
To be fair. Yeah, right. Thank you. But this, I'm going to bring this full circle with this Dr. Ids. Dr. Ids, I don't know if I'm pronouncing it properly. But one of the things I need to do is control blood sugar and get some cholesterol under control.
And that's very easy to do. With diet and exercise if you have the education.
Right. And so one of the best things that you can do, surprisingly enough, is just up your oats content or intake rather, right? Yeah. So like oatmeal in the morning. Now you probably shouldn't put 3 scoopfuls of heavy molasses, dark brown sugar in there. And, I'm not saying maybe I should rephrase that. You shouldn't do that if you want the benefits of.
Yeah.
You should definitely do that.
A little really bit, it's okay.
Yeah.
Everything in moderation. So we'll talk more about that.
Check me out, my relatively uneducated self on this topic. But oatmeal, right? And almonds, diced apple, not very much of it, a little bit, right? A little bit of cinnamon.
Okay.
Some trip agonists in there, and and that's pretty much it, right? A lot of times water, even though I do like milk, so sometimes I'll do milk. But anyway, and working on this for a while. This is one of the many dietary and behavioral changes that I'm in the process of making. And then this video comes up on TikTok. somebody going on about how oats are horrible because they have X, fill in the blank, one little
Right.
thing, and this is shown in studies to have an effect on blah blah blah. Well, and then Doctor, I'm going to prove you wrong comes on, and he's like, yep, well, you need to look at the whole food because there are interactions in the food and things that combine together, and that was one of the things that this is where it comes all together. Right? Stay with me for 2 more seconds. When we were in Cincinnati, one of the things that we talked about is how foods as a whole there are benefits of that over supplementation, how foods interact with one another, how foods interact with over-the-counter medications and prescription medications. And you all excited? I'm just totally amping you up for part 2 here.
Yeah.
I would love to get into that stuff and talk about that.
For sure, because that's, again, that kind of comes back to the education piece. And then we can talk about, I mentioned cooking well, before, but we talk about that in Cooking Well. And we can talk about it here because those are things that people need to know.
Yeah.
And it just, kind of boggles my mind that this, should be common knowledge because eating is something we do every single day.
Multiple times a day.
Hopefully, you're able to do that. But we need to know what we're putting in our bodies, how to make those informed choices. If we are taking medications, what things to avoid. And like you're saying with your oatmeal, how to make it so, you could just eat oatmeal plain, but how do I beef it up a little bit and add...
Plain oatmeal is one step above crickets for the you gotta put something in there.
True.
Right.
But how do I, add other things to it to where it's now a complete balanced meal? Because if you're just eating the oatmeal, you're missing things like protein.
Sure, of
and
course.
A lot of antioxidants. And there's a lot of vitamin E in oatmeal, but you're missing a plethora of other vitamins and minerals. You're going to be missing your healthy fats.
Well, and there's another thing. So if at the table now we have a pretty rich combination of diet and exercise. Your background is more in diet, even though you're an athlete. We'll talk about that next time.
Yes.
Former athlete. And my background is more in exercise science. I would imagine that there is also a component to a healthy diet, much like when people ask me, well, what workout should I be doing?
Yeah.
And the first answer for most educated individuals on the topic is the one that you're going to stick to.
Yeah.
And so I would imagine that to an extent, there's something with diet as well, because you have urges, and there are some people out there with just stainless steel resolve that say, well, I'm going to wake up and I'm going to eat this and then I'm going to eat that. And I know people that measure out portions and are very disciplined. That's not me. It's just not me. And so if you told me you're out of shape, your cholesterol's high, your blood sugar's high, you blah, 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 blah. At this point, you're going to make it to 70. And this is what you need to do to live longer. And you laid that out. Well, you need to measure this, and nothing is enjoyable about the diet. Now, there's a small chance that I would say, you know what? I had planned on living through this century anyway. That's the truth. So I'm going to go ahead and just buckle down and do it. I can be disciplined. Done it before. But there's also probably a much larger part of me that says, well, 70's not bad. Might as well enjoy it.
There's a lot of people like, well, I'm going to die anyway.
Exactly.
So.
But what you don't get in that whole mix is, at what point, 51, 55, are you spending the rest of that time to 70 just absolutely miserable, non-functional, out of money because of health care, draw on your loved ones, not able to live at home anymore because you need somebody to take care of you.
Right.
And so much of that can be obviously diet related.
Yeah.
And prevented in some cases.
And so that's why you get into the kind of at least when I talk about it, you talk about lifespan and health span. And if you look at countries like Japan and, Mediterranean countries and all that, they have long health spans and lifespans.
Yeah.
So they're living to be like 90, 100 years old. And they're still doing things that are physically taxing at 90, 100 years old, like gardening and fishing and, doing all those things. Whereas then if you look at the West, it's
they're also
they're
active.
also active.
Imagine that.
Yes, it's like this synergy.
Mhm.
But yeah, so they have a long health span as well. So the amount of time they spend having a good quality of life and a good, quality of health as well. And a lot of that is tied to diet, exercise, and time spent. I mean, again, we can talk about this in part 2 because it's a very interesting topic. Time spent around the table with family.
Yeah, I've seen some really interesting research. So why don't we leave it there then? If that's not enough to convince people to tune in for the next one, then I don't know what is, because we can really kind of get down to the nuts and bolts of how to take this and use it the very next time you go to the grocery store.
Yeah.
Can we look it up?
Yeah.
Sound like a plan?
That sounds like a plan.
Well, then let's leave it there. And as soon as we get off the air, we'll figure out a time where we can get back together and we'll get a part 2 out to everybody.
That sounds good to me.
Well, in the meantime, me too.
Yeah.
And I have to tell you, like, we have been planning this for a little while now. And that Cincinnati convention was a while ago.
Yeah.
And so I've been very much looking forward to this. And I had a feeling that there was not going to be enough time to cover it all. So let's say we'll do part 2. And if it turns out being part 2 and part 3, then we'll just roll with it.
Okay.
All
That sounds good.
In the meantime, thank you for coming in.
Thank you for having me.
You can't do a part 2 and part 3 if you don't start with part 1. Right?
Exactly.
Unless you're George Lucas. But that's under a joke.
I get it.
All right.
Thank you for joining this episode of The Price of Pain. Opinions expressed on this podcast are solely those of the host and guests, and not representative of the University of Florida or parent institutions of our guests, unless specifically stated. You can find more information about Price on the World Wide Web at price.ctsi.ufl.edu. And keep up with our researchers on social media by searching Facebook for UF Price, by following @UF_Pain on Twitter, and Price of Pain Podcast, all one word, on Instagram.